When a stranger lashes out at J.D. Vance in a cafe, could his unexpected reaction change the room? The cafe hummed with the soft clatter of cups and the low murmur of conversations. Outside, a gentle Cincinnati breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly baked bread from a neighboring bakery. Inside, the warm tones of wood and golden light from Edison bulbs created a cozy haven for those seeking respite from the day's demands. At a corner table, Vice President J.D. Vance sat quietly, dressed in a plain jacket and worn jeans that seemed intentionally unremarkable. He was a man who rarely had moments to himself, and this felt like stolen time. A paperback lay open on the table in front of him, untouched for several minutes as his thoughts wandered. He had spent much of his life feeling out of place, starting from his Appalachian roots to the halls of Yale Law School, and now in the labyrinth of public office. Even here, among strangers who likely didn't recognize him, he felt the weight of his title, a burden he had willingly accepted, but that sometimes left him yearning for anonymity. The quiet cafe, with its warm smiles and bustling baristas, offered a brief escape. Vance leaned back in his chair, taking in the scene around him. A couple at the window whispered and laughed over shared desserts. A young man in a college sweatshirt typed furiously on his laptop. Nearby, an older woman sipped her tea, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. It was a snapshot of ordinary life, a world he once belonged to, and in many ways still longed to connect with. His mind drifted to memories of his Appalachian childhood, the hills, the tight-knit community, and the hardships that had shaped him. He thought of his grandparents, who had raised him with grit and love, and of the struggles that had driven him to seek a better life. Public office had offered him the chance to make a difference, but it had also thrust him into a role that some saw as out of touch with his roots. He often wondered if they were right. The cafe door swung open with a jingle of bells, pulling Vance from his thoughts. A man entered, his heavy boots echoing against the wooden floor. His presence was commanding, not because of his appearance, a simple flannel shirt and work jeans, but because of the stormy expression on his face. The man's eyes scanned the room, landing squarely on Vance. "You!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the cafe's peaceful hum. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and heads turned toward the commotion. The man pointed a finger at Vance, his hand trembling slightly. "You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" Vance froze, caught off guard. The man's tone wasn't just angry, it was deeply personal. The air in the cafe grew heavy, the once inviting warmth now tinged with tension. The barista behind the counter paused mid-pour, her eyes darting nervously between Vance and the man. The man took a step closer, his voice rising. "You sit there like you're one of us, but you're not. You're just another elite, pretending to understand people like me. You don't know what it's like to struggle." The accusation hung in the air, charged and raw. Vance met the man's gaze, his calm demeanor belying the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. He had faced criticism before, angry letters, heated debates, public protests. But this was different. This was face-to-face, immediate and visceral. The cafe patrons watched in stunned silence, their breaths held as if afraid to shatter the fragile moment. Some looked at Vance with curiosity, others with sympathy, and a few with apprehension, unsure of what might happen next. Vance took a slow breath and pushed his chair back slightly, enough to create a sense of openness, but not so much as to seem defensive. He gestured gently toward the man. "Why don't you tell me more about what's on your mind?" His voice was steady, measured. It wasn't a politician's rehearsed tone, but something softer, more genuine. The man blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected response. His clenched fists loosened slightly, though his posture remained tense. "You want to know what's on my mind?" The man spat. "Fine. How about the fact that people like me are out here losing our jobs, our homes, our families, while you sit in your office making decisions that don't help us? You don't care. None of you do." The words spilled out like a dam breaking, each one sharper than the last. The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension thick enough to cut. Vance listened intently, his expression unreadable but not unkind. He didn't interrupt, didn't deflect. He simply let the man speak. As the tirade continued, the man's voice cracked, revealing the pain beneath the anger. His grievances were personal, rooted in a lifetime of struggles that he felt had gone unnoticed. The room was still, the only sound the distant hum of the espresso machine. When the man finally paused, his chest heaving with emotion, Vance leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "I hear you," he said quietly, "and I want to understand. Please, go on." The man hesitated, his anger momentarily dulled by the sincerity in Vance's voice. The room remained silent, the cafe patrons now fully invested in the unfolding drama. It was a moment of vulnerability, charged with the potential for either escalation or resolution. Vance held the man's gaze, his calm presence an anchor in the storm. The man's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in his frame easing as he considered the invitation to share his story. Around them, the cafe seemed to exhale, the unspoken hope for peace hanging in the air. The confrontation was far from over, but a door had been opened, a small crack in the wall of anger and mistrust. And in that moment, the possibility of understanding began to take root. The cafe seemed frozen in time, its usual warmth now replaced with palpable tension. The man stood firm, his hands balled into fists at his sides, the weight of his anger radiating outward like a storm cloud. His glare bore into Vance as if he were a stand-in for every grievance, every injustice the man had ever endured. "I'm not sitting down," the man growled, his voice low but cutting. "There's nothing you could say that would change a damn thing." The cafe patrons exchanged nervous glances. A few looked toward the door, as if silently debating whether to leave before things escalated further. Others pretended to focus on their coffee cups or laptops, but their ears were unmistakably tuned to the scene unfolding in front of them. The barista, who had been wiping down the counter, paused mid-motion, her rag hanging limply from her hand. Vance remained seated, his expression calm and unthreatening. He had dealt with hostility before, but this confrontation felt different. The man's anger wasn't just directed at him. It was the kind of fury born from years of disappointment and disillusionment. Vance could feel the weight of it, and it reminded him of faces he'd seen growing up. Neighbors, uncles, friends of his grandparents, all carrying burdens they felt powerless to set down. "I understand if you don't want to sit," Vance said evenly, his tone devoid of condescension. "But I'd still like to hear what's on your mind." The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't get it, do you? You people never get it. You sit there in your suits. Oh, excuse me. Your everyman disguise and think you can talk your way out of everything." He jabbed a finger in Vance's direction. "You don't know what it's like to struggle, to lose everything you worked for. You don't know what it's like to be told to pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you don't even have boots to begin with." The cafe fell even quieter, if that were possible. A couple near the window shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The older woman with the knitting needles placed them down in her lap, her gaze fixed on the scene with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Vance leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was steady, measured. "You're right. I don't know your story. I don't know what you've been through. But if you're willing to share it, I'm here to listen." The man faltered, the force of his anger meeting the wall of Vance's unyielding composure. For a moment he looked as if he might turn and walk out, but then his shoulders tensed, his fists unclenched, and he let out a bitter laugh. "Listen?" he repeated. "You think that's enough? Listening doesn't fix anything." "Maybe it doesn't," Vance admitted, "but it's a start." The man's jaw worked as he mulled over the words. The anger in his eyes hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, tempered now by a flicker of something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or curiosity. Slowly he pulled out the chair opposite Vance. The legs scraped noisily against the floor, drawing winces from a few patrons. He sat heavily, his posture rigid, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His movements were defensive, as if bracing himself for an argument he was certain he'd lose. Across the table, Vance remained relaxed, his hands folded in front of him, his expression open and attentive. The barista resumed wiping down the counter, though her eyes kept darting toward the corner table. A young man near the back of the cafe leaned slightly closer, pretending to adjust the screen of his laptop. The tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer the threat of an explosion, but the taut anticipation of what might come next. "So," The man began, his voice rough. You want to know what's on my mind? Vance nodded. If you're willing to share, I'd like to understand. The man let out another bitter laugh, shaking his head. Fine, but don't expect me to hold back. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and began to speak. His words came out in bursts, uneven and sharp, like water forced through a cracked pipe. He talked about losing his job when the factory he'd worked at for 20 years shut down, about the months he'd spent searching for work that didn't exist. He talked about the nights he spent lying awake, wondering how he'd keep the lights on, how he'd feed his kids. He spoke about his wife, who'd left him 2 years ago, taking their children with her. She said she couldn't handle it anymore, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Couldn't handle me anymore. His bitterness toward the system, the elite, and even himself poured out in waves. You talk about the American dream, he said, his voice rising again. But for people like me, it's a nightmare. It's a lie they tell us to keep us working until we drop. The cafe patrons listened intently, their faces a mix of sympathy and discomfort. The older woman with the knitting needles dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The young couple near the window held hands, their earlier smiles replaced with solemn expressions. Even the barista, who had been moving around the counter as if to create a semblance of normalcy, paused to listen, her brow furrowed in thought. The man's anger began to soften as he continued, the sharp edges giving way to something raw, more vulnerable. You don't get it, he said again, though his tone lacked the venom it had before. Seeing someone like you, someone who's made it, it makes it worse. It reminds me of everything I'll never have, everything I lost. Vance didn't interrupt. He nodded occasionally, his expression thoughtful, but he let the man speak without interjecting. He knew this moment wasn't about him. It was about giving someone who had felt invisible the chance to be seen and heard. When the man finally stopped, he leaned back in his chair, his arms dropping to his sides. He looked exhausted, as if the act of speaking had drained him of whatever energy he had left. The cafe remained silent, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Vance took a deep breath, his mind racing as he prepared to respond. But he didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, giving the man's story the respect it deserved. The stranger sat stiffly in the chair, his knuckles resting on the edge of the table, as if anchoring himself to something tangible. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment, it seemed he might storm out. But then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders sagged. The act of sitting down, of staying, had taken more out of him than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. You want to know why I'm angry? Fine. I'll tell you. The cafe, though humming with the quiet clinks of cups and murmured conversations, felt as though it had collectively leaned in. The patrons, though careful not to stare, were riveted. Even the barista stopped mid-motion, her gaze flickering toward the corner table, where the conversation had become the room's quiet center. The man began to speak, his words sharp and uneven. I worked at the same factory for 23 years. 23 years. Started there when I was 19. My dad worked there before me, my brother too. It was all I knew. His voice broke slightly, but he kept going, his tone laced with frustration and pain. Then one day they shut it down, just like that. Said it wasn't profitable anymore, or whatever excuse they gave us. Hundreds of us out on the street, no warning, no backup plan. He paused, his hands curling into fists. Do you know what it's like to tell your kids you can't afford their school supplies? To sit at the kitchen table and wonder which bill you're going to skip this month? It eats at you, man. It makes you feel less than. The rawness in his voice reverberated through the cafe, and the clinking of spoons on saucers stilled. Even those pretending not to listen were visibly moved, their faces etched with empathy. My boy, he was 13 when the plant closed, the man continued, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the cafe wall. He asked me why I couldn't just find another job. You're a hard worker, Dad, he said. And you know what? I tried. I swallowed my pride and applied everywhere. Walmart, gas stations, landscaping. But nobody wants to hire a 50-year-old man with bad knees and a GED. He rubbed a hand over his face, his voice trembling. And my wife? She couldn't take it. The fights, the stress. One day, she packed up the kids and left. She said it wasn't just about the money. It was me. I wasn't the same. How could I be? I felt like a failure, like I couldn't give them what they deserved. His words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, the cafe seemed to breathe as one. A woman near the counter dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, and the young couple by the window sat closer together, their hands clasped tightly. The older woman who had been knitting earlier put her work aside, staring at the man with an expression of quiet sorrow. The stranger took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. Everywhere I go, I feel like people are looking at me, judging me, like I'm nothing. And then I see someone like you. He gestured at Vance, his eyes narrowing. Someone who's made it. Someone who's got everything. And it makes me so damn angry. Not because you don't deserve it or whatever, but because it feels like a reminder of everything I'll never have. Vance listened in silence, his gaze steady and unwavering. He didn't interrupt or offer platitudes, knowing instinctively that the man needed to let the words come out, raw and unfiltered. The man's voice cracked again, and for the first time, his tough exterior seemed to crumble. I hate feeling this way, he admitted, his tone softer now. I hate being angry all the time. I hate what it's done to me, what it's done to my family. But I don't know how to fix it. And seeing people like you, people who look like life's just handed them the golden ticket, it makes me feel, I don't know, invisible. The vulnerability in his words was almost too much for the room. Some patrons looked away, ashamed of their earlier judgments. The barista, who had been staring openly, suddenly busied herself wiping the counter again, though her movements were slow and distracted. Vance leaned forward slightly, his expression kind but serious. I hear you, he said softly, his voice steady, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know exactly how you feel. But I do understand what it's like to feel like the world is stacked against you. I've been there too. The man looked up, his brow furrowed. You? Come on, you've got everything. Vance smiled faintly, shaking his head. I've got some things now, sure, but it wasn't always that way. I grew up in a small Appalachian town where nobody expected much from me. My mom struggled with addiction, and there were times when I didn't know if we'd make it through the month. I've had my share of fights with the world and with myself. The man studied him, his expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. So what? You made it out. You're one of the lucky ones. Maybe, Vance admitted, but I know luck isn't the whole story, and I know that when you're in the thick of it, it can feel like you're drowning and nobody even notices. The man's shoulders slumped, his defenses lowering bit by bit. That's exactly it, he muttered. Like nobody notices. Nobody cares. I care, Vance said simply. And I'm sorry that it's been so hard for you. You don't deserve to feel invisible. No one does. The man's eyes glistened, though he quickly looked away, blinking hard. The cafe was silent, the weight of the exchange settling over the room like a blanket. It was as if the man's story had opened a door, not just for him, but for everyone in the room, forcing them to confront their own assumptions, their own capacity for empathy. For a long moment, neither Vance nor the man spoke. The quiet hum of the cafe began to return, but the mood had shifted. Conversations were softer, more subdued, as if the weight of what had just been shared had touched everyone present. I don't know why I told you all that, the man said finally, his voice low. I guess I just needed someone to hear it. And I'm glad you did, Vance replied. Sometimes just being heard can make all the difference. The man nodded slowly, his tough demeanor softened by the cracks in his armor. And for the first time since he'd entered the cafe, he looked less like a storm waiting to break and more like a man trying to find his way. The room was still, the air thick with the weight of the conversation. The man sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, his face a mixture of disbelief and reluctant reflection. The tension that had once filled the cafe had dissipated, but the quiet lingered, heavy with understanding. It was as if everyone in the room knew something important was unfolding, something that transcended the usual noise of their daily lives. Vance sat across from him, his gaze steady but not accusatory. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice softer now, more personal. You know, I understand more than you might think, he began, his tone measured but sincere. I wasn't always in this position. I wasn't always the person you see today. I grew up in poverty too. My mother struggled with addiction, and I had to learn to fend for myself at a very young age. There were days when I didn't know if I'd make it out, when I felt like the odds were stacked against me. The man looked up at him, his expression skeptical but intrigued. He had expected the usual response from someone like Vance, a politician, someone who had lived a life far removed from his own. But this was different. Vance's words were grounded, honest, and without pretense. I didn't have a clear path, Vance continued, leaning in slightly. I faced a lot of doubts. People telling me I wasn't good enough, that I wouldn't amount to anything. I faced my share of stereotypes too, just like you. People assume things about you when you come from a place like mine, just like they assume things about you because of your situation. It's easy for the world to write you off, to think your struggles don't matter. The man shifted uncomfortably, his defenses rising a little. So what? You pulled yourself up by your bootstraps and made it out, and now you're supposed to be a success story? Vance smiled, a faint, almost sad smile. I wouldn't call it a success story. I've had my share of mistakes, my share of failures. But what I've learned is this. Life isn't a straight line. It's not about being perfect or even being lucky. It's about fighting through the hard stuff and about realizing that we all have our struggles. They might look different, but they're all struggles and they all matter. The man fell silent, his arms uncrossing slightly as if the weight of Vance's words was starting to settle in. There was a brief flicker of something in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or a quiet challenge to the anger that had defined him for so long. You're not the only one who's faced something hard, Vance continued. I get that it's easy to look at someone like me and think I've got it all figured out. But people project their frustrations onto me too. They look at my position and think I'm the problem, just like you looked at me today and saw someone out of touch. But that's the thing, when we do that, we're just turning our pain into judgment, and that doesn't help anyone. The man looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. Vance's words had cut through the anger he had been carrying for so long, the anger that had been his shield. He could feel the walls he had built around himself starting to weaken, brick by brick. I get it now, the man said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. I've been angry for so long, at the system, at people who don't understand, and I took that out on you. You didn't deserve it. Hell, you didn't even know what I was going through. Vance nodded, his expression one of understanding. I didn't, but I'm listening now. And that's the thing. People don't listen enough. We see each other as these separate, unrelatable beings. The privileged, the struggling, the elite, the forgotten. But when we stop and listen, when we truly hear each other, we start to see the person, not just the label. The man sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his own anger seemed to dissipate. I've been so consumed by my own bitterness, by everything I've lost. It's like I couldn't see past it. I couldn't see that you might have your own battles, your own struggles. Vance leaned back, giving the man space to process. That's the thing about pain. It doesn't discriminate. We all carry it in different ways, but we all carry it. And when we let that pain turn into anger, it just isolates us. It makes us forget that we're all in this together. The man looked at Vance then, really looked at him. He had expected someone to preach at him, to tell him he was wrong or that he needed to change. But what Vance had offered instead was something far more powerful: understanding. I never expected this, the man admitted. I thought you'd just brush me off. Hell, I thought you might get up and walk out, like everyone else who thinks they've got it better. Vance smiled gently. I'm not here to brush anyone off. We're all human. We all have our stories, and we all have something to learn from each other. There was a long pause, a silence filled not with tension, but with the kind of quiet that follows a profound shift in understanding. The man sat back in his chair, his fingers no longer clenched into fists, his posture a little more relaxed. It was as if a weight had been lifted from him, one he hadn't realized he had been carrying for so long. I don't know what comes next, the man said, his voice quieter now. But I know I can't keep living like this. I can't keep holding on to this anger. Vance nodded, his gaze steady. It's a process. It won't happen overnight. But the first step is being open, to listen, to understand, to see beyond the labels we place on each other. The man nodded slowly, as if for the first time in years. He was allowing himself the possibility of change. He wasn't sure how it would look, or what it would take, but something inside him had shifted. The anger that had defined him, that had consumed him, no longer had the same power over him. As he looked up at Vance, there was a flicker of something, respect perhaps, or recognition of the shared humanity they now saw in one another. It was a quiet, subtle moment, but for both of them, it was a moment that would stay with them long after the conversation ended. The man's hand stretched across the table, trembling slightly. For a moment, Vance wondered if he would pull back, unsure or unwilling to make the gesture. But instead, the man firmly grasped his hand, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice soft but clear, "for everything, for assuming things about you, for making you a symbol of everything I've been angry at. I was wrong." Vance's response was immediate, his hand returning the shake with sincerity. "It takes strength to share what you've been through. I respect that," he said, his voice calm but imbued with a quiet understanding. There was no judgment in his words, just a simple acknowledgement of the vulnerability the man had shown in those moments. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but for both of them, it marked a pivotal moment, a shared understanding that transcended the initial anger and division. It wasn't about agreeing on everything. It wasn't about erasing their differences. It was about the recognition that beneath the surface, they both carried burdens that shaped them in ways they hadn't fully understood before. The man sat back in his chair, staring at Vance for a long moment, as if processing the enormity of the shift that had just taken place. Then with a final sigh, he stood up, his movements slower, more deliberate. The tension that had once gripped his body had loosened, replaced by something more reflective, more thoughtful. He turned to the cafe around him. I, I want to apologize to everyone here," he said, his voice ringing out across the room. "I'm sorry for the way I acted earlier. I shouldn't have let my frustration spill over like that. It wasn't right." The other patrons, who had been watching the scene unfold, exchanged looks, some nodding in quiet approval. It wasn't every day that someone took ownership of their actions, especially in a public space. The atmosphere in the cafe, once filled with tension, had shifted into something warmer, more open. Even the barista, who had been lingering behind the counter, smiled faintly as she continued her work. The man didn't linger. He wasn't looking for more attention, just for the chance to leave with some semblance of peace. As he made his way to the door, he paused, turning back to face Vance. For a moment, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. The man's eyes were glassy, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I didn't expect you to listen, but you did. I I think I needed to hear it. I needed to hear that someone, anyone understood." Vance nodded, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. You were the one who opened up. That's where the change begins." The man gave a small, grateful nod, and without another word, he exited the cafe, leaving behind a room that felt just a little bit lighter, a little bit more connected. The door swung shut with a soft chime, and the cafe returned to its usual rhythm. Chatter, clinking cups, the hum of the espresso machine. But something had changed. Vance sat back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. The man's departure had been quiet, but the ripple effects were undeniable. As he looked around the room, he saw the faces of the other patrons, some still lingering in conversation, others lost in their own thoughts. He wondered how many of them had their own stories, their own burdens they carried in silence, just as the man had. How many of them had found a moment of quiet transformation in the midst of what had started as a chaotic, heated exchange? He picked up his coffee cup, now cold, and stared into the dark liquid, his thoughts lingering on the power of empathy. It wasn't about fixing everything, he realized. It wasn't about having all the answers or offering solutions. It was about showing up, being present, and listening. Sometimes that was all it took to help someone see beyond their anger, beyond their pain, and into the possibility of change. As he prepared to leave, he thought about the journey that had led him to this moment, the difficult roads he had walked, the struggles he had faced, and the lessons he had learned along the way. And in that moment, he realized something important. The act of listening, of truly hearing someone else's pain and perspective, had the power to transform not only the person sharing their story, but the one who listened as well. It was a shared exchange, an unspoken understanding that bridged the gap between two people who, on the surface, seemed worlds apart. Vance stood and made his way to the door, his heart lighter than it had been in days. As he stepped into the cool afternoon air, he looked back at the cafe, where the ordinary had become extraordinary in the space of a few moments. He thought of the man, of his apology, and the quiet dignity with which he had acknowledged his own mistakes. The lesson was clear. We all carry burdens unseen, and sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen. The simple act of hearing another person, truly hearing them, could change the course of their life, and ours as well. The cafe door closed behind him with a soft click, and he walked away, knowing that the ripple effects of that conversation would continue far beyond the walls of that little cafe.